and welcome back to another episode of Microgravity Mischief. In this episode, we are going to be exploring the idea of using an ion engine drive to transport cargo and or habitation modules out to the Artemis Gateway Station. Now, I realize that engineering is an endless game of give and take, where you have to sometimes make sacrifices where you don't want to reap the benefits of other effects. However, I'm not sure that all things scale well. We can make small airplanes and big airplanes, but I'm not sure that the ion engines scale up to a size, or at least in this episode, I'm using a lot of them. I don't know how much power and how much battery charge they use and how much power it drains. I don't know how feasible this is. On the other hand, you could use nuclear engines. The problem with nuclear engines is you've got to launch a fission reactor off the ground up into space into a stable orbit. And the idea of sending radioactive material into orbit is very dangerous, because if you have an incident or the rocket explodes, it's going to blanket the Earth with an isotope that has a half-life of like 10,000 years. And then once you get it into space, I'm not so sure that hydrogen would be the best fuel for it, given that hydrogen atoms going through a chamber full of neutrons could pick those neutrons up and become tritium. And then as you're accelerating prograde to get away from the Earth, you're spitting this stuff out retrograde, which then is going slow enough that it might travel back down to the surface and blanket the surface. I don't know if helium would work. I know hydrogen is also a pain in the butt to contain. So maybe use some form of fuel that, and I know I'm rambling here, but maybe use some sort of fuel that isn't going to become a radioactive isotope as you run it through a reactor like that. That being said, our cargo is loaded and it's time to go to the moon. So we're going to begin our burn with the moon behind the Earth, as we're going to have to conduct multiple burns to take advantage of the Oberth effect and maximize our fuel. These ion engines have a fantastic ISP, but they're very low power, so we want to burn at periapsis for fairly short duration burns, rinse and repeat over and over until we raise our apoapsis high enough to arrive where the moon is going to be once we get there. You can see that the burns we're conducting use up a lot of electricity, so that's why we're carrying a lot of extra solar panels and batteries. I'm sure that there is a mathematical way to maximize power versus weight and mass, and around we go. You can see that the same amount of change in velocity is affecting our apoapsis more and more as it gets further from the Earth. That's due to the fact that the gravity is an inverse square law. So if you double your distance, you quarter your gravity. Very similar to radiation dose rate. Double your distance, quarter your dose. Overall, I still think that there's a big niche for the Artemis program that Elon Musk isn't really interested in filling using SpaceX's Starship. I think that his plans are to do a lot of heavy lifting to get to Mars, and his Starship is going to be really good at getting to orbit and returning from orbit with full reusability, and therefore it'll be very useful. I don't think he wants to tinker around too much with the Artemis. I think his goal is Mars. So I think there's a niche here for companies to maybe take advantage of SpaceX to bring up a ion engine drive like this and assemble it in space, and then use Starship to bring cargo up. And then in this niche, there's money to be made bringing stuff to and from the Artemis Gateway Station. I didn't spend a lot of time tinkering with the maneuver node on the way out to the lunar sphere of influence, and I ended up having to make a big inclination change and orbital correction to line up the periapsis and apoapsis of the Lunar Gateway Station. So, forgive the lack of calculus in my life, but the idea here is once I get this ironed out, we're going to be docking with the Gateway Station, dropping off our cargo, and then the interesting part comes when we exit the lunar orbit and head back to Earth. You can see that the heat shield will do the majority of the work returning to Earth. Really, fuel-wise, it's only a one-way trip. Now, you can use conventional engines, but like I said in the Mars freight train, SpaceX would have to deliver a lot of fuel, and at that point, why don't you just use, really the only reason you wouldn't use the Starship just to take the cargo all the way to Mars is because of the 6-month journey, and those spacecraft are going to be really good at lifting heavy loads up and out of Earth, and rather than sitting in solar orbit for 6 months on the way out to Mars, or I guess maybe they could do it in 3, but they're going to be burning a lot of extra fuel to do that. So here we are docking with the Artemis Gateway Station, and now we're going to exit our lunar orbit, which really from this near rectilinear halo orbit configuration can happen only once a month, which I think is limiting. But like I said, engineering is a lot of give and take, so I'm not really going to criticize their decision to do this. So as we exit the lunar sphere of influence, we're going to be entering Kerbin, planet Kerbin, and KSP, or representative of Earth, in a polar orbit, and we're going to use our heat shields to mildly dip into the atmosphere and do a lot of braking, and there'll be a lot of rinsing and repeating of this process. As the deeper you go, the more damage it's going to do to your spaceship. I think, like I said in the last video, it might be a good idea to have a bunch of little CubeSats tucked away in cargo compartments of this thing so that you can fly them every once in a while and do a visual inspection to assess the wear and tear or any real damage to the heat shield, so that over time you could develop a bulletproof procedure which would add significantly to the longevity of the equipment. And every once in a while, as you get closer to your desired orbit, you're going to have to conduct prograde burns on the apoapsis side to raise your perigee a little bit higher in the atmosphere, because if you do accidentally slow down too much, the atmosphere's got you, and you're going to burn up in the atmosphere and become destroyed. So here we are closing in on our circularization process. Elon brought reusability to the first stage, and he's working on bringing it to the second stage. There's several other rocket companies out there working on second stage, I think, which is definitely the hardest stage. Orbit is tough. Blue Origin certainly hasn't had to worry about that yet. So, in essence, why not have something that's also reusable and stays in space for a very long period of time, doing a lot of lifting? And there we go, conducting our prograde burn to circularize. And we are done. I hope you leave a like and a comment. Constructive criticism is always welcome, and I'd love to see or hear or learn of any gaps in my knowledge that would make this more of a possibility.